system. And so today we're talking about fluids. How the fluids in our body are managed, how the fluids in our body are excreted. So the urinary system is made up of 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, 1 urethra. Kidneys, do you have an idea what kidneys are? Yep. The ureter is just the tube that connects the kidneys to the bladder. So that's why there's 2 of them. You have 1 tube for each kidney. They both lead to the same bladder. And then the urethra leads from the bladder to the outside. The kidneys are going to take blood. They have a lot of blood flowing through them. When the blood gets to the kidneys are actually going to take the vast majority of the water, the salt, the sugar, all of those things out of the blood, and then it's going to determine how much of that to put back in. Usually, almost all of it's going to go back in. The part that does not go back into the bloodstream goes to the bladder as urine. And so urine is just the leftovers from that filtering process. They take everything out, put 90% back into the bloodstream, and that 10% goes the other way to the bladder. The kidneys are very, very, very important organs. We overlook them, sort of like the liver, but the kidneys play roles in a lot of different functions in our bodies. Number 1, they're going to control the level of most of the ions in our blood, either directly based on how much it pulls out of the blood, or after it pulls it out, how much does it put back in. It also can secrete some hormones that help control those ions. It's also going to control blood volume and blood pressure. How do you think the kidneys can control blood volume and blood pressure?
By water.
By water. What about the water?
They can take it out and put it back in.
Yes. So if you take water out, you're reducing blood volume. How do you influence blood pressure? Well, just by taking the water. By changing the volume, you influence the pressure, right? If you have a hose with a lot of water in it, you have high pressure. A hose with a little bit of water, you have low pressure. The kidneys are going to maintain our blood pH. We talked about the bicarbonate buffer system, and we talked about how we can kind of control that with our breathing. We breathe out CO2, we're breathing out acid. But that is really a short-term fix. If we change the pH by our breathing, that is a short-term fix. Long-term control of pH is controlled by our kidneys. Our kidneys are going to secrete bicarbonate, just like in sodium bicarbonate or baking soda. They make that bicarbonate and put it into the blood. And so that's going to neutralize the acid that our cells are constantly making. Every time we burn sugar to make ATP and energy, we're making acid. And so we need our kidneys to make bicarbonate a base to neutralize that acid that we're making. We said the kidney produces hormones, and it also takes the waste from our blood and secretes it. And so the first step, we're going to take the water, all of the good ions, all of the toxic things out, and then we're going to put the good things back, leave the bad things out, and they're going to go out in the urine. So the kidneys are a little bit below the liver. The liver would be kind of here, but they're in the very, very back. Okay? They basically touch the muscle, the small amount of muscle that we have in our back here. And then there are a pair of them with 2 very large blood vessels going to each. A very, very large artery and a very, very large vein. Why do you think those blood vessels going to the kidney are so large? Yes?
Because they're
purpose of the kidney is to filter blood. And so all of the blood in our body, as it's going through the circulation, has to go through the kidney. Something like the intestine only needs a portion of the blood. It needs to get enough blood so that it gets the nutrients it needs. But the kidneys need to receive all of the blood. So we have very, very large blood vessels going there. So from the kidneys, we have the ureters coming from the kidneys down to the bladder. The bladder is here, and the urethra leads from the bladder to the outside. The kidneys, because they have so many functions, and because they need to work so well, they're fairly complicated in terms of internal structure. But just keep in mind, their purpose is to filter things. You have a filter where most stuff goes through the filter. Large things can't pass through that filter. All the little things go through, and then there's pumps that pump most of that stuff that went through back to the other side. And the toxic things keep on flowing through. The kidney is inside of what's called a renal capsule. It's basically a membrane. There's a membrane around that kidney, and then on the outside of that membrane is adipose tissue or fat. So if you see a kidney, it's almost completely covered in fat. Why do you think that is? Protection, yes. The kidneys are all the way in the back. They're kind of exposed, right? You've heard of kidney shots, where somebody punches you in the kidney. Having a layer of fat around that provides a little bit of cushioning. Internally, we have a number of different parts, and these different parts will make sense when we look at the diagram. But essentially, there's the cortex, which is the outside of the kidney, the medulla, which is the inside, and then the cortex and the medulla, or the medulla, are made up of pyramids and columns, which are just based on their shape. Okay? When you see them, you'll say, that looks like a column, that looks like a pyramid or a triangle. And then there are a couple other minor structures that we'll see. With our liver, we said the term hepatic referred to liver, renal refers to kidney. And so that's why these start with the renal, and the blood is entering the kidney through the renal artery. Arteries carry blood to things, so this is the renal artery. Veins carry blood from things, so blood leaves the kidney through the renal vein. Within that kidney, the functional part, the actual filter and pump part, is called a nephron. And in each kidney, there are actually about 1 million of them. And so in each kidney, we have 1 million filters working constantly. And so if we have 2 kidneys, we have 2 million filters that are constantly working to filter our blood. So here we see a cross-section of the kidney. On the outside, it looks like a kidney bean, right? Looks like a brown kidney bean. On the outside, you're seeing the cortex. The cortex is this outermost layer that goes around. It's not just the very thin part here, but it's this lighter colored part that goes around the outside. The medulla is the inner, darker part here. If you look at the medulla, it's triangle shaped, right? That's the renal pyramid, triangle shaped. So the medulla is all of these pyramids put together. Each individual part of it is the pyramid. And then the column is basically where the cortex kind of shoots in between the pyramids. Do you see that? And so it's long and skinny, and it's coming in so it looks like a column. On the very inside, we have these structures that are going to collect the urine. And so the filtering process is going to go on out here. It's going to work its way into this structure here, which when it comes out, turns into the ureter. And so that's where that minor and major calyx comes from. They're just different branches. We have small branches that come together to make a larger branch, which comes together again to make a larger branch, which turns into the ureter. So the minor calyx feeds into the major calyx, which feeds into the renal pelvis, which becomes the ureter. And then once it's in the ureter, it's going to flow down the bladder. The nephron, which is a microscopic structure. We can't see the nephrons here. The nephrons, there's a million of them, and they're spread throughout this area. But the nephron itself has two parts. There is what's called the renal corpuscle. That is the filter part of the system. And then there is the tubule, which is where whatever goes through the filter flows into, and then there are pumps to pump important stuff back into the bloodstream. So the corpuscle, like I said, that's where the blood is going to be filtered. And the corpuscle is made up of a glomerulus and a glomerular capsule. Glomerular capsule is going to be sort of the shell, and the glomerulus is going to be the actual filter inside of that shell. The tubule is where whatever fluid goes through a filter is going to go into, and then as we move through that tubule, there are different regions. And each region is going to serve a different function. We'll learn the different functions of these, but just after you go through the corpuscle or through the glomerulus, you'll enter the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal means close. And so it's the proximal convoluted tubule because it's closest to the glomerulus. After that, we go through the nephron loop, and you'll see it's called a loop because it has a loop shape to it. After that, we go to the distal convoluted tubule. It's distal because it's the one that's further away from the glomerulus. If you have multiple of these, remember there are 1 million of these systems in each kidney. And so they're going to flow together to make larger and larger tubes, eventually leading to the bladder. And so these convoluted tubules first feed into something called a collecting duct. Let me fast forward a little bit and show you the diagram. So this is the corpuscle. The corpuscle is made up of the glomerular capsule, which is the outside shell. The glomerulus is the filter. This is just a blood vessel bringing blood into the corpuscle. And then the glomerulus is essentially a filter that gets inserted through the blood vessel. So anything that wants to get to the other side, the other end of that blood vessel, has to go through that filter that you just inserted. And that filter is the glomerulus. Whatever goes through that filter ends up here. Large things can't go through. What do you think would be a large thing in a blood vessel that would not fit through a filter?
Blood clot.
Proteins? Blood clots? What's a blood clot made out of? Blood cells. Yeah. So the filter is more or less going to leave out cells and proteins. Anything else, sugars, ions, salts, water, alcohol, anything like that, it's going to go right through it. It's like just a strainer, okay? If you're big enough, you can't get through, you stay in the blood. But everything else, no matter how important it is, ends up here in the renal tubule. And so the first part, what's the first part of the tubule? Proximal convoluted tubule. And then what comes after that? After the proximal is the nephron loop, yep. And then after the loop is the distal convoluted tubule. As we move through this, we're undergoing what's called tubular reabsorption. The vast majority of stuff that gets taken out of the blood is going to be reabsorbed. All that water that comes out, we can't lose all of the water that flows through our kidneys, or we would dry out really, really quickly. We can't lose all of the salt and all of the sugar and all of that stuff that comes through. We can't allow it to leave the bloodstream. So most of it's going to go and get pumped back in. The part that is not, whether it be excess water or excess salt or toxic metabolites that our body made, are going to be secreted into the urine by tubular secretion. So once you're in the tubule, you have two processes going on. The things you want to save are reabsorbed. The things you don't want to save are secreted. So the glomerular filtration is, like we talked about, is just blood going through a filter. And it's pushed through that filter by the blood pressure. If you've ever had a filter, you know you have to have something pushing the stuff through. Whether that's gravity or whatever, a pump or whatever it is, you have to force things through that filter. In our case, that force is just coming from the blood pressure. Tubular reabsorption is going to take almost everything and put it back. And the tubular secretion is going to take the things that we don't want and put it through all those interconnecting tubules that eventually lead to the bladder. This is a glomerulus. And so we have the capsule, we have the blood vessel coming in, and then these kind of wispy looking things are the filters. They're cells that wrap around that blood vessel, and so anything that gets through that cell, through that filter, ends up over here, which leads into the tubule. Anything that doesn't just keeps on going through. So you can see it's the same shape as that, right? You got that C shape and the blood vessel coming into it. So the nephron, remember, is the functional part. That is that corpuscle and the tubule. It's lined by epithelial cells. Why do you think it is epithelial cells? And what type of epithelial cells or what epithelial tissue do you think it is? Definitely simple. In this case, it's actually simple cuboid. But
that makes sense because tubules.
so let's think of it this. So it's a good question. Why? Where was the simple squamous? No. That was stratified squamous.
The lungs?
Say it again?
The lungs?
Lungs. Lungs. Simple squamous was in the lungs. What's the difference between the function of the lungs and the function of this kidney structure? Nick? The lungs expand a lot, yes.
Diffusion and filtration.
Yes. She said diffusion, infiltration. Which one does diffusion? The lungs. We want things to pass as freely as possible across that single layer of cells. So we want them as thin as possible. Whereas the kidney, we want to filter. If you have a very, very thin filter, it may not work as well. And so we can only have one cell thick, but that cell can stand to be a little bit thicker. So it's kind of a cuboidal shape. Yeah.
So are the epithelial cells along the renal tubules, are those simple cuboidal?
Yes.
And then what about in the rest of the kidney?
You're going to have a lot of different types of tissue. I wouldn't worry about the types of cells in the non-nephron part, though. The nephron part is the functional part, where you're filtering, you're absorbing, you're secreting. You want a single layer of cells, and they're going to be cuboidal. The one way that we can control this process, yes?
So are those three things, the angiotensin and all that, are those hormones?
1, 2, 3. Yeah, those are hormones.
Okay.
So we can control, we can't control what gets through the filter and what doesn't get through the filter. But once everything is through the filter, we can have very, very fine control over what gets secreted and what gets reabsorbed. And that's going to be determined by hormones. Angiotensin 2 causes the reabsorption of sodium and chloride. And in our body, water follows sodium. So, if we are reabsorbing the sodium, what do you think that does to the amount of blood in the amount of water in our blood? The sodium is getting pumped back into the blood. So the water follows it, so we end up with more blood, more water in our blood. What does that do to our blood pressure? Increases it. And so some of the most popular blood pressure medications out there are called Ang-2 inhibitors. And so an Ang-2 inhibitor will block reabsorption of sodium. And so the sodium goes to the bladder. If the sodium goes to the bladder, water goes to the bladder. And so if water goes to the bladder, it's coming out of the bloodstream, blood pressure goes down. Angiotensin 2 also causes the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. First of all, where is the adrenal gland? On the kidneys, the part you have on top of the kidneys, right? Where is the adrenal cortex? Outside. Just like with the kidney, the cortex is the outside. Same thing with the brain. So the adrenal cortex is going to release aldosterone, and then the aldosterone is going to float right from the party hat, down into the kidney, and when it gets there, it's going to cause the reabsorption of more sodium and chloride. And so it's going to cause a double effect. Angiotensin 2 causes reabsorption of sodium. It also causes the release of aldosterone, which causes the reabsorption of sodium. And so it's kind of a double whammy. It's a very strong system. Another hormone that controls this is atrial natriuretic peptide. We learned about that in the endocrine lecture, and I said natriuretic referred to what? Do you remember? It's the Na. Just focus on the Na here. Sodium. The atomic symbol for sodium is Na. The old name for sodium was natrium, or natrium. That's what this is referring to. And so this is going to inhibit reabsorption of sodium. And if you do that, you release water, the sodium, into the bladder. The water goes with it, and you lower your blood pressure by reducing your blood volume. We can also control directly how much water gets reabsorbed. How much of the water that goes through that filter gets pumped back in. We can control it by controlling the sodium, the water will follow it, or we can directly determine how much water gets put back into the bloodstream, and that is anti-diuretic hormone. The process of taking this water from the bloodstream with the kidneys is called diuresis. Diuresis. And so an anti-diuretic blocks diuresis. A diuretic is possibly a type of a drug or medicine you've heard of. A diuretic increases the rate of diuresis, which then causes you to urinate. Caffeine is a diuretic. Alcohol is a diuretic. Then there, of course, if you go to the doctor, they don't tell you to go home and drink a six-pack, right? They give you a drug. They give you a drug that does that. It can also be called a water pill because it essentially causes you to release water from your body. So here we see this in a more physiological or anatomical drawn way. So the glomerulus is up here, right? The corpuscle here, and the tubule is here. Now we see it's not just this straight little tube that goes across the board. It has this curve to it, and sure enough, the curve is the loop. And so we leave the glomerulus, we go into the proximal convoluted tubule, the first part here, and then we end up in the loop, we come down, we come back up, and we go into the distal convoluted tubule. This breaks it into early and late, but you don't need to worry about that. It's just one big distal convoluted tubule. And so what we see here is that each part of it plays a different role in determining what gets reabsorbed. And so this is saying that in the proximal convoluted tubule, 65% of the water that got filtered out immediately goes back into the bloodstream. 65% of the sodium and 65% of the potassium go straight back in. 100% of glucose should go back into the bloodstream. We spend energy getting that glucose into our bloodstream. Whether that was eating or digesting or whatever it is, we don't want to lose that glucose. So 100% of it should go back in. And so what we're going to see on a later slide is that they can measure kidney function, or at least reabsorption function, based on how much glucose is in your urine. If they can detect glucose in your urine, this process isn't happening correctly. They can also detect whether the filtering process itself is working by looking for protein in your urine. Because proteins are big. They shouldn't have gotten through that filter. If they did, the filter must be broken. Something must have punched through that filter. So you don't need to know the individual things, but I want you to know that the vast majority of reabsorption happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. As soon as you go through the filter, most of it goes back in. I realize you can't probably read that very well, but it is on the slide. You can go home and read it. So this doesn't really show us anything different than what we've seen, but it shows a schematic of all the different blood vessels, okay? We didn't talk about most of these. You do not have to memorize this entire series of blood vessels. But at the top, we have the renal artery, which goes to the kidney, and it branches and branches and branches and branches. And then eventually we start heading back out, and at the very end here, we have our renal vein. So you can see the artery coming in, it's going to branch and branch smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then eventually come back out the other side and end up in the vein. So, whatever does not get reabsorbed becomes the urine. After leaving the kidney, it drains into the minor calyces, which then join together to form the major calyces, which then come together to form the renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis turns into the ureter. Just like arteries turn into arterioles, or turn into capillaries, and things like that, they just branch. They feed into each other, and every time they branch, they have a different name. But they are more or less the same thing. They're just smaller and smaller branches of it. The ureters lead to the bladder, and then the bladder leads to the outside through the urethra. We saw that. We saw that. So the bladder is essentially a water balloon. It is hollow. It is stretchy. It's designed to fill up, and as it fills, it gets bigger and bigger. But in the walls are muscles. And so we can contract that bladder to force the urine out. Micturition is urination. That's the technical term for urination. The urinary bladder contains transitional epithelium. Do you remember the purpose of transitional epithelium?
Stretches.
It's stretching, yeah. And so transitional epithelium, when it's not stretched, is kind of cuboidal in shape, but then it stretches and it transitions to squamous. The muscular wall has smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle in the bladder is detrusor muscle. From the bladder, we said we lead to the outside to the urethra, and the micturition reflex is the contraction of the bladder and the muscles around it that are going to cause the release of the urine. And so the detrusor muscles in your bladder are going to contract, but we also have sphincters that normally hold urine in. And so when the bladder contracts, we need to release those sphincters. And so we have an internal urethral sphincter and an external urethral sphincter. And so if those two don't relax, we can't urinate. That shows what we just talked about. So normal urine, we normally have about 1 to 2 liters per day of urine. Okay? Depends on how much water you take in. Anything between 1 to 2 would be considered normal. Urine is normally yellow color, but there are things that we can eat, things that can be wrong with our body that would lead changes in that color that would tell someone what is wrong. For example, it says that beets, if you eat a lot of red beets, I don't know who eats red beets, but if you eat a lot of them, your urine will actually turn red. Urine should be more or less transparent. It should not be cloudy. If it is, that means something is wrong. urine should have a characteristic urine smell. It should not smell like an old litter box. That's after urine has started to break down. If it has an odd smell, that also tells you something is wrong. I can't remember what the genetic disease is, the underlying mutation, but there is a disease called maple syrup urine disease. It's a genetic disease in that it makes those people's urine actually smell like maple syrup. And so, like I said, I don't remember what's not working that causes that, but that's a very good way, and that's how you diagnose it. The first sign is someone comes in, most likely to their doctor, and says, my urine smells like maple syrup. Then hopefully the doctor realizes this is maple syrup urine disease. The pH of your urine can vary dramatically. There's a wide range that is considered normal, but the average is about 6. Why do you think it can vary so much? Depending on what you eat. Yeah. And so if you eat or drink something, a lot of acidic things, your body needs to get rid of some of that acid. And so some of that acid is going to come out through your urine. And then you can actually determine the health of kidneys in someone by looking at the density of urine. Specific gravity is another term for density. So if you measure how heavy the urine is, you can tell how many things are dissolved in that urine. So that will tell you a number of things about that person. So some things that we shouldn't see in the blood. Number 1, we have albumin. Albumin is blood protein. So like we said, protein should not get through the filter. If it does, that means that the filter is busted. We said glucose should get through the filter, but should 100% be pumped back into the blood. You're always going to miss a tiny fraction, and so that's normal to see a very, very small amount. But if you see any significant amount, that's not right. Red blood cells, white blood cells, you shouldn't see those either. They shouldn't have gotten through the filter. Or if they're actually coming from the other side of the filter, that means you're bleeding in your kidney or in your bladder or something like that. There is no way that you should have cells in your urine. Ketone bodies are they're a metabolic byproduct. When you break down protein, you make ketone bodies. So there should be some of them. But if there's a lot of ketone bodies, that means something is wrong with your metabolism. I'll skip these. And then down at the bottom, we have microbes. Urine is a very, very, very good environment for bacteria to grow. But when urine comes out of the body, it should be sterile. If it's not, that means the bacteria are in your kidneys, they're in your bladder, they're wherever they're coming from. They should not be there. And so one way to test for something like a bladder infection or a kidney infection is to just take some urine, put it on a petri dish, and see if it grows. It shouldn't. But if it does, you now have a sample of the exact bacteria that are growing in that person's renal system, urinary system. You give it to a microbiologist or a pathologist, and they come back and say, this is the species of bacteria, which means you should give this antibiotic. I think they need help. Let's take our break now. You can go help them if you want. We'll start at 10 after on that clock.
Don't go. I don't think we're talking.
Somebody else right there. I don't know who it is though. I'm guessing it's Taylor.
I feel about like that right now.
Taylor, is that your name?
No.
Taylor?
Mine's a little. Wow, the 120 is a tiny little paper.
I think I might have figured out correct my name or mine. It might be mine.
Yeah, I think it is. So that doesn't explain where Taylor is.
So how it's like,
If, if your quiz was folded, can you please look inside of your quiz?
Oh, wait.
So you have it?
No, I don't.
Like you're saying, like it could be inside someone else's
Yeah.
quiz. It's right here.
It's great, right?
Yes.
You were on the bottom, so I grabbed the stack, and the little one got left behind.
It's okay. I just make sure never to be on the bottom again. I tried it first.
Oh, it would be the first one, fine.
I didn't realize that was the last one. So you stood there and I was like, oh. Yeah.
Well, actually, the one on the bottom would have been the one I graded
I like this one.
for, yeah, which would have been the last one
Last
I
one
turned
you
in.
picked up.
Yeah.
They're pretty good. And I was like,
I just want to know.
That's a nasty disease, the maple syrup thing.
So what is what causes it?
It is
I didn't until I
a
started going
defect in
to
1 to 3 genes. It's a chain of
No, I.
amino
I skipped
acids.
your
always
always
Mm-hmm. I know it's something.
It cannot break down amino acids. Leucine,
What I do to get over
Leucine, that's one of the amino
and
acids.
isoleucine,
Isoleucine.
and
sleep for like.
valine,
Baleen.
baleen.
Like
It can't
way
filter it,
too
so it builds up in the
And then
bloodstream.
when I wake
Ah.
up.
It can cause brain damage
Yeah, I have to like
You better make time.
skip out all
and
like,
eventually
relax in
mental
class.
disability.
I take it out every day. I wish. Well, not every day, but every Tuesday and Thursday. And Wednesday.
Symptoms of the disorder is coma, feeding difficulties, seizures,
Lunch might have time.
vomiting, and
I try not to. do
lethargy.
I can't sleep at night, like,
So actually,
that. I can, but like,
Doesn't that sound?
I always complain about how I
Awesome.
don't
and I
get
don't have
stuff
time,
done.
Mhm.
I'm busy.
You pretty much have to get dialysis.
Really?
Yeah, the treatment.
What?
Through your belly, or the main, or the maple syrup.
Oh.
You pretty much, you're stuck on a low protein diet for life.
Is that when there's too much protein or too much sugar?
It's a bunch, it's three different things.
They have trouble digesting and breaking down some of the free amino acids. So if you eat a bunch of protein, you get more of those amino acids.
If you have a kidney infection, is there only one way to get it, or is there like multiple ways? You know what I mean?
Oh, to contract it?
Yeah. Like, can you only get a kidney infection from like inside, or can it go backwards?
Oh, I would think the vast majority of kidney infections are going to start in the urethra and go up.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to figure if it was possible to get a kidney infection that did not travel up.
Is it?
I think you'd have a hard time unless you had some sort of injury or something. I suppose if you had a very bad systemic infection, so it was bacteria in your blood, they would end up in the kidney. And so then it's not really a kidney infection; it's a whole body infection.
Why do my eyelashes
So when you have kidney failure, how do you know? I know it's probably obvious, but
You get very sick, and then you start to figure out why.
Yeah, my friend's in the hospital right now.
Kidney failure is bad.
Yeah,
It's bad news in terms of prognosis, but even if you go live with it, it's just not a good thing.
especially the diet.
Dialysis is
Yeah,
not.
machine.
My granny had that.
My friend's worst died from kidney failure.
And she had cirrhosis of the liver.
That's just not good.
No.
So once you have maple syrup disease, you're stuck with
Did
it.
you look it up?
Well, it's genetic.
It's genetic, yeah.
It's genetic, so you're born with it.
Yeah.
And so someone would have to develop a therapy that we don't currently have the technology to do.
Yep.
So what is it?
It's where your body can't break down the amino acids. The defect in one or three genes.
You can't just like take a chromosome out of our DNA.
That's gene therapy. And so we can do it in experiments. We can do it in animals. But gene therapy in humans has very, very, very low success rates.
Can animals get Down syndrome or autism?
what used to be called.
I feel like I've seen like a cat.
I don't know.
Looks kind of,
I mean,
yeah.
Down syndrome, that's trisomy 13?
21.
21? So you'd have to have an animal, I mean, if you have an extra chromosome, so you're going to lead to an imbalance of genes that are on that chromosome. And so for an animal to have the same symptoms, same appearance, they would have to have the same genes on that chromosome. And that's probably unlikely. And so they could most likely have something similar,
Yeah.
same idea,
Right.
but probably not all that close related.
Well, what does gene therapy use to treat?
Currently, I think the only thing it is, I don't know if it's FDA approved for anything. I think the only thing that's really very far in clinical trials is for blindness and muscular dystrophy. UF is actually one of the biggest gene therapy places in the world.
Hmm.
I have a lecture on gene therapy. I have an entire course worth of cancer lectures. Just don't have time.
$5. That's why it's my good. I know.
Okay. 10 after.
Ready?
So, we're going to talk more about fluids as a whole. Okay? We're more or less done with the kidneys. Now we're going to just talk more kind of big picture about fluid in our bodies. So, when we weigh ourselves, the majority of that weight, 55 to 60%, is from body fluids. The solids in our body are the minority of our weight. Of that fluid, only 2/3 of it is inside cells. A full third of that fluid is extracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid is just the cytosol. It's the water inside of a cell. The extracellular fluid can be interstitial fluid, which is fluid that is not in a blood vessel. It's just kind of in a tissue. Okay? Or it can be blood plasma. So only 20% of the third is blood plasma. And so that's only a very small fraction of our total body water is actually in the form of blood plasma. So this is just breaking that down. So our total mass, 55% fluid, 45% solid. That 60% fluid is 2/3 intracellular fluid and 1/3 extracellular. The 1/3 is split 80-20, with only 20% in the blood. So of those fluids, the water makes up 45 to 70% of our body weight. In that fluid mass, they're also including the things that are dissolved in that fluid, like salt and sugar and things like that. We've learned previously what an electrolyte is. An electrolyte is an ionic compound that is not an acid or a base. So when you dissolve it in water, you get ions, but those ions are not hydrogen, and they are not hydroxide OH. We need to control electrolytes in our blood because electrolytes control the water. Like I was saying, we can control where the sodium goes, and where the sodium goes, the water will follow. We take in and lose about 2.3 liters of water a day. That's 230 milliliters of water. A standard water bottle is 500 milliliters. And so almost 6 of those a day that we take in and get rid of. If you don't take in that much, you don't lose that much. And so as long as you're not dehydrated, perfectly fine. Because essentially, what our body's goal is to balance water gain with water loss. Okay? So the water coming in, most of it is liquids that we drink. A good portion of it, though, is liquids from the food that we eat. We don't think about that. You see those people saying you need to drink 8 cups of water a day or whatever number they made up when they said it. They don't think about all the water they get in the food. Cats drink very, very little water. They get almost all of their water from their food. If you've ever watched a cat actually drink, they lap and lap and lap and basically drink nothing. It just kind of, it's like the water's evaporating as fast as they're drinking it. That's why you're supposed to give them wet food along with their dry food. Because dry food has very little water in it, whereas the wet food helps them get water into the system. Cats who don't get enough water, because they just don't drink very much, and they eat only dry food, have a tendency to get kidney problems. Because they don't have enough water going through the kidneys. Yes?
My cat was on a dry food diet for a while when I first got her, and I switched her to Friskies after that. She ended up getting like crystals in her bladder because she like something happened with her bladder, and so now she only eats it exclusively wet diet.
So you switch from dry food to wet Friskies?
Yeah, it was the Friskies that did it. Just Friskies was worse.
Well,
Apparently.
my guess.
That's what the vet told me. She's like, oh yeah, Friskies is McDonald's for cats. Don't ever give that to your cat. And I was like, great.
So I'm not a vet.
I know.
My guess is that the cat had underlying genetic abnormality that prevented them from properly digesting the poor quality food. It would be my guess.
Now she eats expensive nutrition.
I've
She's
been
fine now.
I've been there. It's not cheap.
No, it's not. $35.
Yeah. So we drink water, we bring in water in our food, but we actually are constantly making water. When we break down sugars and things in our body, we get water. That's the metabolic water. We actually make about 200 milliliters of water a day in our body. If our water gain and our water loss are both average, normal numbers, and they're going to balance, we lose about 1,500 milliliters or 1.5 liters of water a day through our kidneys. That's urine. We lose 600 milliliters of water a day through our skin. So imagine that water bottle and add a little bit more. And we lose that much water every day through our skin in the form of evaporation. We also exhale about 300 milliliters of water a day. So when it finally gets cold here in Florida, and you go out in the morning, and you breathe, and you see your breath, you're seeing water that you are exhaling. That is happening whether it is 32 degrees out or 132 degrees out. Okay? That water,
Breathing is 132 degrees out.
you can survive 132 degrees. There are places on Earth that gets 190.
Kuwait gets 120 at night, midnight.
I would imagine, yeah.
Where?
Kuwait.
Is this falling regardless of your activity levels?
No. So, on average. And so, if you're at, what do you think would happen if you are a very active person? What would change on this side?
Your skin would be on fire
Why?
because you would sweat.
Sweat.
You sweat. You're going to sweat. And so you're going to lose more through your skin.
In your lungs.
And what about the lungs?
You do it more.
If you're active, you're going to breathe a lot more. And every time you breathe, you're going to lose X amount of water. So if you just breathe more times in a day, this number goes up.
Right.
So what do you think happens? We need to balance these.
Take more water.
You can take in more water. You get thirsty. What if you don't have water available?
It keeps it.
It just keeps it. This shrinks. As these get bigger, that goes down. The antidiuretic hormone? Yeah. Yeah. And so you would release released antidiuretic hormone to prevent this. Where you run into problems is if this gets so big that you run out of this. This is kind of the exit. This is your wiggle room. If this gets too small, you run out of it. You can't. And so now you're out of balance. You also, your kidneys have to function. Do we have all those toxic things we have to get rid of? Our body's very good at concentrating those and getting rid of a lot of toxic things in a small amount of water, but we can only do so much. And so we have to maintain a certain amount coming from our kidneys. We also lose a little bit in our feces. So the idea of thirst is a mental idea, okay? And that is going to come from the thirst center in the brain, which is in the hypothalamus. Do you remember the main function of the hypothalamus?
Yeah.
No.
What is it, David?
Oh, yes, Muhammad's got
I
it.
said no.
Autonomic nervous system. The stuff we can't control, right? We can control whether we are thirsty or not. We can control whether we respond to that thirst. But we can't control whether we are thirsty. We detect a number of different things in our body, and then we send signals to our hypothalamus, and if it sees signals that tell us we need water, that we are dehydrated, it's going to release hormones and cause a feeling of thirst. We can detect if our blood volume goes down. We can detect increase in osmotic pressure. Remember, osmotic pressure is just the concentration of the salts and things in our body. If the water in our blood goes down, the salts become more concentrated. Think of a glass of salt water that you leave out. The water is going to evaporate, but the salt stays behind. And so the salt gets more and more and more concentrated. We can release that aldosterone, which is going to reduce the loss of sodium. We reduce the loss of sodium. We reduce the loss of water. The ANP is going to promote natriuresis. And so we're going to lose sodium, we're going to lose water, and then there's the antidiuretic hormone, which makes kidneys save water. So when we become dehydrated, we notice a couple different things. Our mouth gets dry, right? We're producing less saliva. Why do you think we produce less saliva? Say it again? Say it again?
Conserve water.
Conserve water. Yeah. We have more important things to do with that water than make spit. And so we make less spit. That causes dry mouth. Our body recognizes that our mouth is dry, and that makes us thirsty. We notice that increased osmotic pressure and that blood volume, and so things are going to happen that stimulate the thirst center, makes us thirsty, which hopefully increases water intake, which brings everything back to normal. We also do this through controlling the sodium and the chloride, but that's the hormones that we've already covered 2 or 3 times. And so I'll just leave this for you to look at. So we have a number of things that control the amount of water in our body. There's neurological things, and then there's endocrine things. And we've talked about each of them. We said we need to control the amount of electrolytes. Number 1, because the electrolytes control the amount of water. And we have to have the right amount of water in our blood. And so that's going to control this osmosis. Osmosis, remember, is the movement of water from places where the salt and sugar are low concentration to where they're high. And so as we move the electrolytes, we can move the water. It's easier to pump electrolytes and let the water just follow than it is to pump water. Because if you pump, let's say you pump 1 molecule of sugar, maybe 5 molecules of water will follow. So it's a lot less work than just pumping 5 water molecules. The electrolytes are also going to maintain that acid-base balance, that bicarbonate buffer. Bicarbonate is an electrolyte. That's what we said was made by the kidney. Electrolytes also carry electrical current. That's why if you're putting Christmas lights up and one of them is broken, the insulation is broken, and you plug it in, you'll light up like a Christmas tree. But we don't want our body to do that, right? So why is it important for us to carry electrical energy? Where did we talk about electrical current?